All right, welcome to Roots of Reality Experiences. I'm joined by Dr. Nicholas Jacobs, who's an assistant professor of government at Colby College. He's one of the nation's leading experts on the urban-rural divide, federalism, and developments in the American party system. Lastly, he recently published a new book with his co-author Daniel Shea called The Rural Voter. So, Dr. Jacobs, thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
So, when did you first get interested in rural politics?
I'm pleased to say before Donald Trump was elected and most people started getting interested in rural politics. The book has had a long gestation period, but no, I started writing about rural politics from a political science uh, point of view or perspective when I was in graduate school. And most of my research is on federalism and the politics of place, but not necessarily a rural and urban type of place, politics of states. And I had the good fortune to be in a graduate program and in graduate school with a now good friend of mine, Cal Munis, who's from Montana, also from rural Montana. And yeah, we just started writing and talking and working together. I was coming at it from angle about federalism. He was coming at it from a point of view on social identity, and just years later, many articles later, thousands of survey questions and respondents later, here we are. And then yeah,
So, did you grow up in a rural area as well, or what's your background?
no, I can't say that I grew up in a rural area. I was on the suburban fringe, which is now fully a part of the core statistical area of Northern Virginia. I grew up on the border between Loudoun County and Fairfax County in the 80s and 90s, and it was an area undergoing profound change. It's still an area undergoing profound change, but my mother in particular uh, she was a school teacher in Loudoun County. She started teaching in Loudoun County when Loudoun County was a rural community.
Okay.
It's parts of it are rural to now, but when I was growing up, the school curriculum was still you had to teach kids how to hatch chickens, and we'd have to hatch chickens every year, and they'd have to go somewhere. So they came to our little suburban homestead. After she'd get done teaching them that, I grew up going to 4-H fairs and sort of traveling out of that. But I wouldn't say that I was born and raised in a rural community by any stretch of the imagination. Just deep
Sure.
affinities for it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Kind of having the balance there, I guess, growing up where you did. So,
Mhm.
how would you say then, throughout your career and studying this topic, how has rural politics changed over the last several decades?
I think, well, one, I think rural politics has become a discrete category of politics, whereas once rural politics, I think it would have been very difficult and perhaps misleading to talk about such an abstraction. I mean, there's always been rural people, for most of this country's history, rural politics was just politics.
Sure.
And there's always been, and many people know the history of various rural movements in this country's history, none more important and definitively rural than the capital P populist movement of the late 1800s. But for most of our politics, you know, ruralness was a subset of local feuds or intra-state conflict. And the rural politics, for instance, of Maine would not have been comparable to the rural politics of Montana or of Virginia. The South in rurality was its own
Yeah.
thing. And that's not to say that that type of distinction still isn't true. In fact, I'm beginning to think in my own work are we running up against the limits of that sort of national abstraction, and do we really need to start taking greater stock of that regional variation that rural sociologists, for instance, I don't think have ever abandoned. But in terms of vote choice at a national level, especially for the presidency, I mean, that's where the rural urban divide is clear. That's where it is manifesting on a national level. Whereas 40 years ago, right, as we show in the book, it was not. And it had never manifested at a national level like that in this country's history prior to the emergence of a rural constituency in the 80s and 90s, 1980s and 1990s.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, because it is fascinating to see just how much politics has become kind of nationalized in terms of what you're affiliated with. I know uh, a lot of former politicians I've talked to that had served, in the 60s or 70s, to say, the whole newspaper setup is so different today since the local newspapers are going away in many places, and it seems like everyone's getting the same sort of flavor of politics from the major media brands now. Um, what do you make of that in terms of shaping what we have today?
I do think the emergence of the rural voter is a part of the nationalization of American politics. I mean, the nationalization of American politics that goes hand in hand with what you've described as a changing media landscape. Also, just changes in the formal organization of party competition, where uh, you know, the local Democrat is or the regional Democrat is becoming the rarity, and that whether you're in West Virginia or California or South Dakota, right, what's expected of you as a certain member of a party is the same everywhere. And I think that's why you don't see regional variation among rural, or we might even say urban voters as well, in terms of uh, vote choice, especially at the presidential level. Nationalization, though, is interesting when it comes to ruralness, because on the one hand, nationalization is often used to describe the fact that, you know, place should matter less. And in some ways that is true, right? That's like the decline of the what Joe Manchin is the exception that proves the rule sort of
Sure.
thing. But what we also see with ruralness is that with nationalization, like place is doing a considerable amount of explanatory work. And what I mean by that is, right, nationally, and given the nationalization of the various parties' core constituencies, right, we know that there's a gender gap. We know that there's a youth gap. We know that there's an income gap, right? All these
Yeah.
fundamental variables at a national level, right, should be explaining things. And yet in rural communities, again, on average, but very little regional variation in the three I'm about to give. In rural communities, there is no income gap. In rural communities, there is no youth gap. If there is a gender gap in rural communities, it actually cuts the reverse way, where women have been more likely to vote for the Republican in the last two presidential elections. And so there's this sort of irony where there's the fundamentals are becoming more important at a national level, and it shouldn't matter where you live. In rural areas, what does matter is where you live and shaping those
Yeah.
fundamentals, with the exception of race, which continues to be a huge cleavage at a national level, but that's neither emergent nor new.
Right. Yeah, that is interesting because I guess um, if you were to go in looking at like the Civil War era and how the country divides itself, it's very geographically based. And now it's
Mhm.
really just the type of person. Are you living in the rural part of a state or are you living in the urban area of a state? Um, and so it is kind of a different type of division that I don't know how that plays out when it comes to how a society deals with its problems, especially with presidencies that are very contested. Um, because it's not like you have a clean split in the country via geographical lines. It's really it's like you have communities outside cities that hate the parts of the city. Vice versa, there's this kind of rivalry. So I don't know what to make of what a country does in that situation.
I don't either. I wish I had the answer. I mean, there's two. One, I do think thinking historically about these problems, you're spot on that, right? Geographic divides are nothing new in this country, partially because our our federal republic, depends on geographic divides.
Sure.
I mean, it's reflective of divides that were in existence in the late 1700s and have continued to reinforce them. But even if you think about, as you reference, right, the Civil War, right, the Civil War is not a rural versus urban phenomenon. No, it's just interesting to me that while we've had sectional divides and geographic divides, we've often used those as a shorthand for the rural and urban divide. But even if you go to the eve of the Civil War, I mean, yeah, 95% of the South lives in a rural area, but so does two-thirds of the North. And so this is a conflict fought through two largely agrarian um, states or amalgams of states, not countries, but sides of the conflict. And then the second thing I found, and this kind of explains how rural politics fits into my larger academic interest with federalism and place-based politics more generally, is like, to your point, right? A lot of the rural and urban conflict we see in American politics is even more pronounced within states, not always, at a national level, but between states, which really doesn't describe a whole lot of rural urban politics. There's very few rural states. But within states, we see, a core and a periphery, and that dominates a lot of how stuff gets done at the subnational level.
Yeah, I mean, I've studied like a lot of politics in Indiana historically, and it's amazing like just how many people today will sort of look at the city of Indianapolis, the capital of the state, and be like, "Yeah, I don't know what's going on in Indianapolis, but yeah, that's all. It's a disaster. That's why I don't go there anymore." And these are people who are living in the rural communities, so it's not like there's not like this sense of kind of state pride that maybe there was before, where people think like, oh yeah, we're going to the capital, that's gonna be great. It's rather it's, oh, the capital is crazy and I want to be out of there. um and I guess that's because you get, the urban politics is typically Democrat politics, while the rural politics is Republican politics. And so it's this sort of the stuff you see on the media, you take it into your own state, and it's like, this is the issue in my state and this state and this
Mhm.
state. So
Yeah, and I do think that's why the overlaying of a partisan identity on top of these geographic identities is so destabilizing. Um, because I think there's probably always been a little bit of that fear of the unknown and sort of little hostility, or there are different ways of living, in
yeah.
all honesty. And I will say to that, though, that somebody needs to find a good statistic on this, and so I will say it is anecdotal, kind of crowdsourced anecdotal wisdom, but that rural people are much more likely to go into urban spaces than urban people are to go into rural. And so there is this unknown and uncertainty about what's going on in each other's communities, despite
Yeah.
that asymmetry. So when it gets then politicized and channeled into a talking point on campaigns, or a way of making sense of who you can trust to make decisions for you, or should do experts really know what's in your best interest, right? This is where it becomes a political problem that confronts us all, and isn't just like a neat heuristic for making sense of history.
Yeah, I think that that makes sense to me, and that's kind of from my experience as well. I mean, especially with so many rural communities, losing sort of hospital access close by. And so there's always a need to go into a city for something at some point in your life. While, unless you're someone who's, you know, interested in doing some type of rural activity, like, maybe you want to go to a pumpkin patch or something,
Hmm.
or apple picking, um, you know, and I don't know how many people even from cities necessarily do that. I grew up in kind of an area of Kansas that was kind of mixed between rural and urban. It was about an hour from Kansas City, but it was, pretty close to a lot of small towns around in the surrounding area.
Hmm.
So to get to Kansas City, you're driving through many different small towns in Kansas. So yeah, I definitely think that is the case from my experiences.
I remember the first time I drove with my wife. We'd been married already several years, and we were driving to see family in North Carolina, and we drove through um, sort of tidewater North Carolina, closer to the ocean. Um, and I remember her looking out the window, and she said, I've never seen people live like this, in all honesty. And I often remark to my students that you have an image of urban poverty. It's not like white middle class kids are going into those spaces frequently, but you at least have images from the news. Very few people have seen rural poverty
Yeah,
and know what that looks like, let alone interact. And again, I actually think there's more in common between urban peoples and urban poverty and rural peoples and rural poverty, even though we're
sure.
talking about a divide. But just in terms of how we live and how we experience the rural urban divide, I always remark that there's an aspect of that most people have not seen unless they've driven through the countryside.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely true. And so that's something that I definitely want to pursue further with you, in terms of like misconceptions about rural voters.
Mhm.
Because, oftentimes, in sort of national politics, especially when we're looking at sort of the Democratic Party, we'll talk a lot about sort of ethnic divides in the country. Um, Yet there's obviously, as you mentioned, there is quite a bit of similarity in terms of the economic divides between rural Americans and people who are living in the inner city. And in fact, I feel like many people in the inner city economically match up probably better with rural voters than the people in the suburbs, who typically are the ones that seem to have the higher economic incomes.
And on a host of other sort of attitudinal measures. One thing that Dan, my co-author, and I are able to do is we're actually able to look beyond, we're able to look within rural. Rural America is, depending on how you count it, which is, always a fun little methodological point, but, it coalesces around 20% of the population. And of that, depending on how you count it, again, anywhere between 20 to 25% of that is non-white. So it's a minority within a minority. And in writing the book and in doing the research that we did, we were actually able to get a sufficient enough sample of essentially, basically non-white rural residents that very few studies can get. I mean, I was just remarking the other day, talking to some researchers, that the American National Election Study, which is the gold standard in my discipline for attitudes on the American population, in 2020, it got 49 Black rural residents. That's it.
Wow.
But but Dan and I, we were sort of able to tease out some of these distinctions, and what we do find though is that on a host of attitudinal measures, feeling looked down upon, um, a kind of peculiar way of thinking about the economy that's more like sociological, or excuse me, sociotropically or socially oriented, like thinking
Hmm.
more about how the community is doing than you necessarily are doing. Um, but also like a pride of place, all of these things. rural whites, rural non-whites, and then urban non-whites kind of have similar
Yeah.
levels.
Yeah.
And that a lot of the difference in geography is being driven by not just race, but also income, which is correlated, but certainly not one to one. And so, I do think that's part of why, again, the geographic divides are so visible and so easy to fall on as a heuristic for making sense of polarization in this country and partisan disagreement. And again, that's not wrong because even though they might share these attitudes come election day, we know that
Right.
that the partisan divide is going to shake out one way, on that the commonalities they share will not hold in that regard. But I do think it's not a point of optimism by any means, but it's more than just an interesting factoid. It really might clue us into what is truly broken about our political system and our institutions, less than, which group of Americans is to blame for being enraged at one another, sort of thing.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's obviously these things are complex, and it seems like people just want to have kind of one glove fits all uh,
Hmm.
type of mentality about why things are a certain way, and there's numerous factors intertwined there. Um, but you know, it's interesting when people talk about sort of how the political parties had kind of shifted in terms of Democrats usually were doing better with working class voters in the past. People will talk about the media and Republicans, the opposite. Now they're kind of switching. Um, I do find it kind of interesting at the same time, though, that the head of the Republican Party is a fairly wealthy businessman, so there's kind of some irony there with that. But how has kind of depictions of rural voters kind of generated support for the Republican Party um, because of just how I guess many feel that they're kind of left behind to a certain extent.
Yeah, and I would point out that even in the futile challenge to take the nomination away from Trump in 2024, right? No Republican contender at the national level has working class or
Right.
rural roots. I
Yes.
mean,
Right.
um,
Yeah.
no, so I mean, I think this is absolutely a fair question, and it's probably the question I get asked a lot, especially, when I'm like knee deep into a presentation on how rural identity matters and place identity matters, and people are like, okay, then why does, the caricature of a urbane billionaire, right, who's so materialistic, throws his name on everything, never would leave Manhattan if they didn't sort of, prosecute him out, sort of thing, right? Like, why him? Why
Right.
him?
Right.
And I and I've thought a lot about this, and I do think it does. It's not going to be a maybe satisfactory answer to everybody, but I think about two things. One, a person that has a strong social identity, be it with their profession, be it with their place, right, which is ultimately how I start thinking about rural voters. I think they use that identity more than just saying like, "Oh, I'm going to vote for anybody that shares that identity with me," right? You vote for people all the time that don't share your identity, but rather speak to your identity in
Yes.
a different way. So I would point that out, that like, when's the last time I voted for, a college professor? If that's my identity, as many people do. No. Um, and nobody sort of asked me why that's weird. The second thing I'd say is that, right, Donald Trump, he, compared to how so many politicians try to play into rural identity, because I think politicians have known this to be a core feature of the rural constituency for a long time. In fact, I think through their rhetoric, especially on the right, about a real America, have cultivated it in some ways. Um, and sort of images of the heartland do loom large in our politics. Sorry, it's an aside, but I'm thinking about a famous ad that Bernie Sanders ran. Oh, it might have been, yeah, it had to have been in 2016, where it is all just images of like people doing good, honest work on the farm,
Yeah.
to right. But oftentimes what happens is that candidates come into rural communities and think they know how to play into that identity. And I'm reminded of a story that a friend told me once about Terry McAuliffe and running for his second term. He had taken some time off by constitutional requirements, so he's running for his second term as Virginia governor. He goes down to Wise, Virginia in the middle of June or July and leans down to this little kid and says, "Oh, you catch any big ones recently?" The funny thing being, it's not hunting season for another few months. And so, like, what is it? Some consultant just told him, like, you'll win over these yokels if you start talking about hunting with them.
Oh my gosh.
And Donald Trump never pretended to do that. He
No.
never pretended to be anything that he wasn't. And in some way, he wasn't authentically rural. That wasn't the question, but he was authentically him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I think just his approach to things in terms of just telling people, I think rural voters what they want to hear, kind of, in terms of he has a pretty good idea of sort of how they're viewing the news cycle and sort of what they pick up on as concerns, and then he seems to just kind of boomerang that back to them, which I think it makes them feel like, okay, this guy is acknowledging our concerns, kind of. Um, Now, whether he actually does anything about it is another story, but
Yeah.
just the fact that, yeah, I mean, the fact that rural people seem to relate more to his style of politics certainly suggests that, um, yeah, the other side of the political spectrum is very far from doing the same.
Right. No, I agree. And I go back and forth, as do many political scientists, like how much did the issues and the specific, policies that Donald Trump put out, not only in running for president in 2016, but right throughout his administration, like how much did that really matter? Um, and I do think there were some things. I think and again, I don't blame anybody because we obviously we have to talk about the things that he says that cut at our what I believe to be our core commitments to be a multi-ethnic
Sure.
liberal democracy. Um, when we did not talk, and I've written about this in other books, you know, very few people talked about the fact that, what really did distinguish, like if you do an analysis of Donald Trump's positions at, say, the Republican primary debates, right? I guess this is like the most top level issue oriented politics we could imagine. So like what does Donald Trump talk about that the other candidates do not? It's China.
Hmm.
China this, China that. I mean, that is rhetorically and substantively the thing that distinguishes him the most. And, why does that play in, Millinocket, Maine? Or why does that play in the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio? Or, in parts of Iowa, right? Because China was the winner of economic developments that took jobs from those communities.
Yeah.
And again, that's not me, Nick Jacobs, saying like that China's evil. Like, no, that was a
Sure.
political and economic choice we made, but people very clearly made the connection in their head. And I think that's the level at which policy is making a difference and that, you know, Donald Trump tapped into. Now, that said, I do not think it was all policy by any stretch of the imagination. And you've had you had candidates in the last primary, and you've had candidates running for other offices that have been, trying to capture some of the policy and issues, especially on the border, and have not had the same level of success as Trump. So it's also about his style and his manner of politics, no hold bar sort of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, that definitely seems to be a major factor. And I mean, I suppose I mean, I guess one of the interesting things, because we're in a country that is so it's divided. I think it's not as nearly as divided as it's kind of made out to be in the media. I
Mhm.
think, there's a lot of people that are not all that politically engaged that just kind of
Yeah.
are there and just kind of wondering what's going on. And I think there's a lot of people that are also just like, I'm just not a fan of politics today in general. And even if I can agree or disagree on different issues from different parties, just the style of everything has become so toxic. It's just, disgusting for a lot of people to try to focus on too much if they even have the time to, in the first place. But yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, how do we sort of come about and try to fix the divisions we do have, which are driving our society into a path where it's really hard to come together. I mean, you think
Mhm.
about the 2024 election and you're wondering, okay, well, regardless of who wins, we're gonna have serious divisions still. so so it's like, what are we gonna do to fix it? Um, and I don't know, what are your thoughts based off of your research and what you're seeing play out?
Well, as I'm racking my brain for a solution to that crisis, if I could just reflect on one thing you
Sure.
said in the lead up, it's your point about engagement and disparate levels of engagement and maybe not being as divided as we are. I take 100% and think you're spot on. And one of the things that surprises most people when I talk about rural Americans, particularly rural Americans and news coverage or media habits, media consumption habits. Um, I think a lot of well-read and smart people know that we've gone through this crisis in journalism in the last 20 years with, the emergence of the internet and declining, ad revenue for classifieds and so on, and can kind of easily imagine like, oh, and that's hit rural communities particularly hard, which it has. The consequence of that has not actually been for rural people to you know run off to their basements and join conspiratorial websites.
Right.
it's
Right.
it's really actually just people stop paying attention,
Yeah.
and rural Americans are the least likely to even follow the news. They're the most likely to say that the news they do hear about's irrelevant to their community. They're not more prone to conspiracies and
Yeah.
doing that type of work, which is again a small sliver. And so it's that as much as we are polarized, there is a sort of apathy and a level of non-engagement that I think among some groups that's equally as troubling. And I think to your question about now, what do we do with all these, comparisons and moving forward? Um, I I ultimately think that what we're experiencing in the political divide between rural and urban areas is a political problem that is a reflection of our party system. And that, I don't have the solution for economic revival. I don't have the solution to the fact that doctors are refusing to come to rural communities and serve us, right? Of all the policy problems, right? I don't pretend to be an expert on any of those. I hardly pretend to be an expert on things like politics. And so what I very clearly have called for in the book, with Dan, is is to recommit the Democratic Party to showing up in rural areas and running viable candidates for office. it's a nonpartisan argument. Look, if I was a scholar of urban politics, I would have said the same thing, that the Republican Party needs to show up in urban areas,
Yeah.
because what we show is that the more rural or urban you get, the more likely you are to live in a community that has no real political competition. And
Yes.
that is a new thing. And as much as we might hate like the sound of political competition, as much as we hate the fact that we basically have two parties in this country, right? Our politics depends on having competitive pressures to hold elected officials accountable, to ensure that the ideas and the concerns that are reflective of your average voter and not your deeply engaged primary voter actually make it to the forefront of political conversation. Like we need that. That's how the system works. I think that's how you begin to rebuild trust, that the system is not failing you, that the elites are not failing you, that like both sides are showing up, actually trying to convince you that you matter and that they want your vote. And in so many communities across the country, again, deep rural, but also deep urban, that's not taking place. And I think I think that goes back to political nationalization, where for a variety of reasons, the national strategy for how you win elections has become much more about mobilization than persuasion. Um, I think that comes down to the nationalization of party bases, which are much less tolerant of local variation in candidates. But it seems to me that that sits at, that is an institutional problem that has no one easy answer, but, but, I think does have it's not so artificial that we can't begin to solve it. And I will say, and I've talked to many people who are way more knowledgeable about party politics and much, much more powerful than me, although that's not hard to be, who have actually taken it upon themselves to learn and talk to me and seem genuinely interested that in the long run, right, even in the middle short-term interest, like this is not a viable system, and that we need to change. And so again, it's not an optimistic note, but hopefully, hopefully the pendulum starts to swing back.
Yeah. Well, I guess obviously we kind of have to, as a society, acknowledge the issue first before we can begin trying to solve it.
Yeah.
So at least we're trying to get people and I think everyone, for the most part, a lot of people understand there's an issue. It's just deciding together collectively, how do we fix it, I suppose. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. It's it's the ultimate collective action dilemma.
yeah.
um and that, but I do think that's why, if I could, again, it's I think it's a problem that affects us all. It's not a Democrat problem or a Republican problem. It There are a lot of great organizations that, to be honest, I think seem more just motivated by the fact that each and every election they have no choice, right? And they're mobilizing and they're working to regain political choice. And in rural communities, that usually means building up the Democratic Party as a way of overcoming the rural urban divide.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it would be good to see. I know from a lot of concerns I've heard from like talking to like former state legislators in Indiana. I get a lot of people that are talking about, well, the balancing redistricting if you're in a state with a supermajority, trying to have a viable candidate in a rural area. If you're like a Democrat, for example, that's incredibly difficult. Since the chances that you're going to have a Democrat win is very, very low. And then,
Mhm.
of course, the just with how much uh, races now cost to run in the first place, like, do we want to put our resources into that part of the state in the first place? Um, it's
And-
there's these issues that seem like our system is not isn't really moving into a direction where it's easy to balance things out to try to get, extract what really the consensus of what people want in the country is, but
Mhm,
rather it's become very manipulated and sort of a game. I mean, it's kind of like, if I were to give an analogy, it's kind of like what you're, seeing with like the NCAA in sports or something like that, where things money is just kind of driving things in so many ways that what used to be college sports or something is very different, just like what used to be politics is very
mhm.
different today.
And yet, I think the point about money, especially. I mean, this is a resource question. I don't think so, especially if you look after changes in democratic organizing after 2008, um, which, right, it's a inflection point because it's a new president. Barack Obama had very interesting relationships with the Democratic National Committee, and the Democratic National Committee began to change their relationship with the state committees, and he maintained a sort of autonomous fundraising and mobilizing. He basically was like an independent candidate with his Organizing for America (OFA). But it's also was a direct rebuke of Howard Dean's, Democrats will compete everywhere and in every race
Yeah.
strategy. And, there was no malevolency. Like that decision wasn't made because Democrats hate rural people.
Right.
It was a resource question. It was our politics is becoming so expensive and we are having to raise more and more funny money, and both sides are equally, we're in deadlocked, um, slim majorities election after election. Like you have to target the communities that you think will be viable, and increasingly that meant, rural communities aren't viable. The other thing I'd say though is as much as we know that something systemic is broken about our politics, rarely, I think, do we keep that in mind when we're making evaluations of what the system produces,
Hmm.
right? And to your point about, the like what are we getting when we watch something that is, athletic spectacles that are so professionalized and driven by money and all,
Right.
like, are we really, like, how do we now evaluate the athletic quality or the beauty of the sport or right? I think we have to ask ourselves the same questions about people that are engaged in politics in such a broken system, and that's not to excuse anybody for their vote choice, but it is trying to just recognize, like, again, at the end of the day in this country we're given two options, and even if a rural community overwhelmingly votes for one of those options, it's not the same thing as saying that that was the option they wanted. That was the
Right.
game, that if they got to design the rules, that's what they would play. And I don't think many people are willing to admit that about a group of people and communities that they've more or less made their mind up upon. And I think it's pretty unfortunate way of thinking about rural Americans.
Yeah. Well, and I think that probably also contributes to the lack of engagement among voters. I mean, how many people will vote in this upcoming election? I don't know. It may not be as high as we would like. I mean, usually I think in every American election, there's a lot of people that don't vote that could. And
Yeah.
I mean, just that fact for a country that is a democracy in a world where there's a lot of countries that are not. And, it's kind of like, wow, how much we take for granted. Um, it's like, these, and so I guess it's difficult. I mean, I wish there were more options for people. At the same time, I wish people actually voted despite the lack of options, given that it does make a difference. I mean, it is kind of interesting, I mean, I guess one of the good things about having very polarized politics, at least in the government spectrum of things. I think the societal spectrum is not, as we talked about, not as polarized, but in the government level, it's pretty polarized. Um, Given the two parties don't seem to agree on a lot, but that would you'd think make it easier for people to decide who to vote for, given that they are very divergent in terms of what their idea of the future America is. But um, yeah, there seems to be so many different aspects that need to be reformed in our society, and it seems like for years we're just kind of putting a band-aid on things but not actually coming together to really solve anything. um, and it just goes on and on and on until I guess at some point something's going to have to give, I suppose.
Mhm. Yeah, and as much as we bemoan the current state of ideological polarization and these stark divides between the parties, right? You go back 2 generations and people were complaining about the party of Tweedledee and Tweedledum, and that there was a difference without a distinction and that there
Right.
was no real choice.
Right.
And I don't, uh, and that's the subject of my first book with Sid Milkus, and I don't think we ever really say it so bluntly, and I'd have to think about whether I truly believe it, but like, which of those two worlds would I rather live in? Both are problematic um, for a number of reasons, right? The party or the society where there's lots of ideological overlap, there's consensus on many things, right? This also means that there's consensus on a lot of issues that we would find in retrospect to be incredibly morally problematic, right? A lot of
Sure.
the consensus of the mid 20th century exists because the Democrats had what Ira Katz Nelson calls a Faustian bargain on race.
Yeah.
So it's tough to say which of those systems is better. And I'm sensitive, being who I am and living in the world that I do, that I
Yeah.
don't really feel comfortable making a claim. Um, and then you just wonder, right, are those the only two options we get, or can we imagine a different type of politics that allows us to overcome those dilemmas? Although I think, we've been trying to figure that out for not just 230 years, but maybe a few thousand years.
Yes. Well, yeah, I mean, human societies don't necessarily are ever really all that easy when it comes to functioning as you would hope they would. I don't think that's ever really the case. I mean, you're always gonna have serious issues in
Hmm.
societies, especially ones that have lots of different people from different backgrounds, and
Hmm.
that's a fantastic experiment to be able to have a democracy. And with all these people coming together, I mean, that's kind of like the grand vision of embracing common humanity. But whether you can maintain it is the question, I suppose, going forward long term. And so I guess from my perspective, the first issue is to try to ensure that just the democratic path forward of democracy is stable, and then trying to fix the issues. I guess you're kind of almost ranking problems like, okay, preserving
Yeah.
democracy number one, and then fixing polarization um,
Yeah,
at the
well,
same
what it's
time.
the
And
it's the worst form of government except all the others, right? I mean, that's
right,
the famous quip. And I
exactly.
and I think that's where I do think that's ultimately what motivates me to think about our political geography and our geographic divides, because there is a there is a common humanity and there is a common, you know, connection that I think the vast majority of rural and urban people feel towards one another. There's a not only an economic interdependence between these places in our modern world, but there's a cultural one, there's a social one. And I think that describes the vast majority of rural and urban, and sure, even suburban Americans too, who I always forget about. What I what I do fear though is that over time, what is beginning to metastasize is an aversion between these groups of peoples based on the little things, although important things, that they don't share. Or maybe even, I don't like saying little things because I do think the things that they can share in common disagreement with one
Yeah.
another. That even though I do think, and again, I don't think that this aspect at all is reflected in our politics. This is actually how Dan and I open the book with the preface is saying, the things that actually, like the reason why we live in a rural community, the reason why I raised my two young boys in a rural community, that isn't a part of rural politics
Sure.
as we've been talking about it,
Sure.
but it is something important to us, and but it is something that should be able to coexist in a pluralistic democracy. Our partisan divide is threatening that coexistence, which is worrisome to say the least.
Yes. Yeah. Especially given that, I mean, there's quite a bit of dependence on each other between urban areas. The agricultural sector of the country is obviously
Mhm.
incredibly important, while the urban areas, that are creating technology and everything else. It seems like there needs to be a little bit more balanced, and perhaps that we even would take some type of government involvement to help maintain that balance, because I think when you see I know when I was living in Kansas, a lot of rural communities losing so much that their communities are gone essentially because of how much stuff is leaving. Um, and when you do that, it's just going to embolden people to become more and more dissatisfied with things. And um, if you're not from that area, you're not going to recognize it. And so you get people that just assume the other person is making vote choices purely out of just them being completely out of touch with reality. When the ultimate reality is that people are out of touch with each other and what their
Mhm.
lives are like.
If I could sum it up with sort of just like two broad data points,
Yes.
which is it's my methodology. Warts and all. Again, the nuance is lost. I'm well aware. Rural Americans, on average, white, non-white, share similar degrees. That if you ask them, if given the choice, would you leave where you live, your community, and they overwhelmingly say no. Not the case in other parts of the country. If you then ask, or random order, different data point,
Yeah.
when you also ask them, well, kids growing up in and around Vassaboro, Maine, have to leave in order to live productive lives, overwhelming majorities, similar degrees and similar margins, say yes. That's a tough world to be in. That's not the world of like enraged wrath, like populist for like I don't know, whatever ism you want to throw on it.
Yeah.
Like that's a world in which people love where they live, recognize the reality that there's something going on that's going to change the way future generations, which is how a lot of people think about the world, what we leave behind, how future generations are going to experience that community. And again, I don't. Nobody has the policy fix to sort out that tension. The best we can hope for is a politics of recognition and respect that acknowledges it and tries to give voice to it.
Yeah. Definitely so. Yeah. It's definitely one of the problems of our time in terms of trying to fix this issue. So what are you currently working on then?
So I'm continuing to work on rural politics, as I mentioned at the beginning, thinking more about divisions within the rural experience. I'm editing a volume with 15 other amazing scholars of rural politics, just on everything from uh, rural resentment within Black, Indigenous, and other persons of color in rural communities. Uh, rural, I'm writing a chapter on some early findings that seem to suggest that in rural communities that have experienced an influx of foreign-born populations, that attitudes are towards immigrants are actually more tolerant than both urban areas that have experienced an influx of foreign-born populations, and so and rural communities that have not. And so this is sort of some confirmatory evidence of the contact hypothesis, which would make sense in rural communities that were
Yeah.
class distinctions are less. So, ruralness is not going away. I am starting, uh, again, I see the connection to political nationalization, and I'm starting to finish is what I meant to say, starting to finish a monograph on how we should think and how we do think about federalism in a national political culture. Because I mean, these two things should not sort of go hand in hand.
Yeah.
But
Interesting. All right. So, but I imagine in general you're gonna be plenty busy for the foreseeable future, given the situation of the world. So,
yeah, unfortunately, I don't see these issues going anywhere anytime soon. It would be nice to like hang your head up and be like, oh well, we
solved.
solved that institutional crisis. And on that point though, I also want to recognize like at like we need to be willing to say that too. And I don't ever want to contribute to a false sense of urgency, and that's
Uh,
why, you know, not that, you know, which yeah, I do think the challenges are severe, um, but hopefully not insurmountable.
yeah. We'll hope for the best. Should be
Yeah.
interesting. And what's the best way for people to keep track of your work?
Oh, I don't know. How does anybody keep track of all the papers and books and
Well,
stuff
yeah, I guess.
written these days? I guess I have a website through the wonderful people at Colby College. I, you know, I must confess, I'm a Google Scholar man myself, and that's how I
Okay.
keep apprised of my colleagues and people I admire. Yep, I just continue to. I don't have a Substack or anything like that. I don't,
Sure.
and I don't have my own podcast. I'm lucky that I have good colleagues to do it for me.
Fair enough. Well, website's good enough, so people can reach out or find your work there. So,
Yeah.
but thank you again for coming on and highlighting this, really important issue, and hopefully we can make some progress on it. So.
Thank you so much, Ben.